Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Do we have anybody standing outside? Yes. Just take your seat. We're getting ready to start. Couple more. Okay. While they're coming in, could I just ask everybody, please silence your phones? And while we're waiting for the last two people at the desk, I'd like to remind you, those of you who I have not already handed the flyer to, the Gross Family Center's next event is on December 5th. It's at Indian Springs Country Club in Boynton Beach, which is exactly 25 minutes from here. It's with Mort Klein, who is the president of ZOA, the oldest Zionist organization in the country, 1897 established. Mort Klein has been deemed one of the 3 most influential Jews on the planet. So I hope you will come. So before I turn it over to the rabbi, I would just like to say that it has been such an honor to work with Rabbi Vigler on this program. This is a very unusual thing for us to have done. It's a very different modality for us as well in the approach to fighting anti-Semitism. And I think Rabbi Vigler has done an amazing job in pointing out what is obvious or should be obvious, as well as those things that are not obvious to us. And I hope that you will all come away with an emboldened view of Judaism and the impact that you can have on the community at large in fighting back and embracing your Judaism. So once again, I just want to give my greatest thanks and gratitude to the rabbi and this Chabad for hosting this series. And thank you all so much for taking my part.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you and working with you. Our visions are aligned. We share the same passion for our people, for our faith, and for the defense and the eternity of our people. It's almost a little nostalgic, here we are, it's Thanksgiving weekend coming up. I used to think that people travel to Florida for Thanksgiving. Turns out half the congregation has left here because I guess they're sick of spending so much time in Florida during the quarantine. So, or whatever we've been doing for the past 18 months. So it seems like everybody's going back to their kids. And I'm grateful for everybody for showing up here today. It's an honor and a privilege to study with you here today. I'd like to give a special mention to a very special guest here with us here today. Everybody's special, but we have actually a warrior amongst us. It is Aaron Bell, also known as Aaron Belsky, together with his wife, Henrika, from the Bielski brothers. Aaron, put up your hands so we know who you are. There he is, Aaron Bell from the Bielski brothers, right here. He is the youngest of the Bielski brothers. Very, very famous. Ishakaya. Aaron, you want to say hello?
Thank you.
Say hello.
Hello, everybody.
This is the guy that stood up to those who try to kill us. He led, together with his brothers, an army of Jewish men, women, and children, and they made sure to leave no Jew behind, as made famous in that very powerful movie. Aaron, you're a legend. Lives right here in Palm Beach, Florida. Dear friend of mine, Henrika, thank you for being here with us. Really an honor and a privilege. Thank you, thank you. So this Russian refusenik makes his way to Israel finally. After all the years of being refused his visa in Russia, he finally makes it to Israel. And as he arrives on the tarmac, kisses the ground of the promised land, there are journalists, paparazzi waiting to document the moment. And they say to him, "Don't you feel amazing? How incredible it is to be here." And they ask him, "No, so tell us, what was it like? What was it like back in Russia? Were you able to practice Judaism?" And he says, "Yeah. In Russia, I was able to practice Judaism." "And were you able to," very surprised by his answer, They say, were you able to wear a Jewish star? He says, yes, I was able to wear a Jewish star. And anything that they asked him about what they thought he was not allowed to do in Russia, turns out he was allowed to do back in Russia. So they said to him, then what are you complaining about? Then why did you come here? He says, because here I can't complain. Back in Russia, of course, God forbid, nobody was allowed to complain because that would be reason to be sent off to the gulags to Siberia. We often encounter anti-Semites in the form of powerful people, whether it's in politics, in the media, or in commerce. There are people that we know every single day that take positions that hurt Jews. But they deny being anti-Semites. Can you think of anyone like this? Think being the key word. I don't want to turn this into a conversation debate. If you could just think of someone who you think is an anti-Semite, but they don't think is an anti-Semite in politics or in commerce or in media, we can probably come up with a name or two or three or four or more. But once we identify them, what is the best response to dealing with anti-Semites in the public forum? That is the topic that we're going to take on today in this fourth and final session of this Outsmarting Antisemitism seminar. It's almost nostalgic to say goodbye, but I hope that you'll come back. We got another great course coming up. I think it's up there on the screen, and you might have some information with you. You should have some information about this next JLI course starting at the end of January, early February. It's meditation from Sinai, a completely different concept, but we have so much to talk about, so much to learn, and we hope that you'll join us for that one too. So let's discuss this topic here today, lesson 4, fourth and final of our Outsmarting Antisemitism series. I'd like to begin with the story of France. In the 1950s and the 1960s, France was the #1 supplier of weapons to the state of Israel. Just before the 6-Day War, President Charles de Gaulle announced an embargo over any nation that's involved in Middle East war, which obviously included Israel. And therefore, France refused to sell 50 Mirage fighter jets that had already been paid for by the Israelis. Now, this was widely deemed as anti-Semitic because it had no impact on the Arabs, because the Arabs, Egypt and the Syrians, were being supplied their weapons by the Russians. And everybody understood that the French had taken this position only in order to gain leverage with the Arabs that they felt were more useful to the French because of oil. This became even worse in 1970, during the War of Attrition. Now, it's one thing to tell us that the jets that we paid for, and these things don't go cheap from what I understand. Last time I searched the Mirage jet on Amazon, from what I understand, it doesn't come cheap, right? But if you already paid for 50 of them and then they don't want to sell it, they don't want to give it to you, that's one thing. But adding insult to injury, in 1970, during the War of Attrition, which is when the Egyptians try to grind down the Jewish presence in the Sinai Desert, then French President Pompidou announced the sale to Libya of 50 Mirage fighter jets. Now, Libya was no friend of Israel. When their new leader at that time, they were sworn enemies of the Jewish people, and it was only a matter of time before these Mirage jets would find their way to the front of the battle. Let's take a look at what the New York Times had to tell us about this story on text number 1, page 116. After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight that about 50 Mirage jets, jet fighter planes would be sold to Libya. Later on, they discovered that it was actually closer to 110 fighter jets. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspected the planes will sooner or later find their way to the fighting fronts. The French Defense Ministry reaffirmed the French embargo policy of selling no arms to the countries directly in conflict. Israel, the United Arab Republic, which was then the name of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and said that they were convinced that Libya sought to supply her own forces. Peaceful purposes, right? Israeli fears of the Libyan mirages is based on a conviction shared by some French experts that the Libyan Air Force in its present state could not absorb such numbers of a highly advanced plane. The fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken toward Israel by the new revolutionary military regime, which has been in power in Libya since early September. The plane sold to Libya is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same type as the 50 built for Israel, but placed under embargo in 1967. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling, mind the pun, galling the fact that they had been denied about the same number of planes now made available to a hostile Arab country. No? So how would you react? What would you do if you were able to respond to this particular travesty? As it happened, in February 1970, President Pompidou was about to visit the United States. What would you do? Any suggestions?
Organize a rally or a march?
Organize a rally or a march. That's probably what we would do, right? Organize a rally and show them that we are deeply insulted, we're angry, and there's no way we're gonna take this laying down, right? Of course.
And stop eating French food.
French fries. Chuck out the French fries. No more, right? Today we'll explore, as Lauren introduced, the Torah sources for dealing with this. What was the word that you used, Lauren? You said Jewish pride or something like that. Something along those lines. It was fantastic. We'll explore the Torah sources. We're Jewish, and we'll explore our own heritage, what our own Torah has to tell us in terms of a biblical precedent of how we are to respond to such circumstances. Sadly, they are not few and far between. This is stuff that is essential knowledge for us modern day American Jews today. So I'd like to turn your attention to a powerful precedent which was used by many of our ancestors for inspiration. It's actually the theme of the Torah portion this past weekend. By divine providence, it happens to be the Torah portion read by Jews around the world this past weekend. It's the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the third of our patriarchs. The story, quick background here on Jacob and Esau, they were two brothers, twins, born as twins to their parents, Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac was the second of our forefathers. Rebekah was the second of our matriarchs. And their children were Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esau. As it happened, these twins could not have been more different to each other. Jacob was a Torah scholar, a dweller of tents, innocent and pure. Esau was a wild hunter, what you might call a wilde chaya. You know what that means, right? A wilde chaya is a wild, like a wild man. He's just hunting. He's all over the map. He's aggressive. He's violent. He was actually a murderer as well. And as it happened, Jacob, out of character, steals the blessing that was supposed to go to his older brother Esau. This is all accounted in the Torah. So Jacob steals the blessing which was supposed to go to his brother Esau. Esau gets very upset. He doesn't take it well. And he decides to kill his younger brother. Jacob runs away for 34 years. When eventually he comes back, now with 4 wives. Interesting Torah, right? He had 4 wives. He had 11 children. Ultimately, he was going to have 12 tribes of Israel that come from him. He had 11 children at the time, and he's about to face his nemesis, his worst nightmare, Esau. He sends angels in the Torah portion we just read this past Saturday. He sends angels and messengers, actually, to find out, to read the temperature on his brother. How's he doing? Is he still mad? They come back with the worst news possible. Not only is Esau coming towards you, he's armed to the teeth with 400 mercenary soldiers. He's really upset. So Jacob now is facing a situation where his brother is trying to kill him, and he's going to figure this out, and he's going to think fast. Let's take a look at how Jacob responds in the biblical precedent. It's here in text number 2, page 119, when the Torah tells us that Jacob prepared himself for a three-pronged approach, three-pronged response: a prayer, a gift, and armed struggle. So prayer is something that we learned about in the first session of this course. We learned that God is always present. He's testing us. He wants to know if we still believe in him, right? When things go south. So you've always got to make sure that your faith is strong. Remember Esther in the Purim story? We learned about that in the first class of this course. We said that Esther prepared to meet King Ahasuerus to save the Jews in Purim. She first fasted for 72 hours, spiritual preparation, and only after that she engaged in diplomacy. Along the same lines, Jacob came long before Esther, 1,500 years in fact before her. Jacob now does the same. He prepares spiritually, but together with that, he does not one but two diplomatic or two physical efforts. One is he prepares a gift. The second, he prepares for war. Now, the gift that Jacob sent to Esau was massive. In those days, currency was cattle, flock, sheep, livestock. He prepared massive herds of different kinds of livestock that were supposed to march in front of Jacob, miles and miles ahead of him, so that Esau was going to ask, who are these sheep? Who owns these? And the messengers were supposed to say, they belong to Jacob, but they're a gift to you from him. So this was supposed to soften the blow. He was preparing. He was sending his diplomatic bribe to his older brother, to his anti-Semite, to his Esau. It was all designed to arouse compassion. Of course, if that didn't work out, he also was holding a stick. He was prepared to wage war, but that only as a last resort. So very similar to Esther. Prayer, the fasting, together with appealing to the king, Jacob does the same. He prays to God, but together with that, he sends this massive gift. Now, as Jacob does this, he engages in this diplomacy in order to arouse the compassion of his anti-Semites. Do you think that Jacob looks weak in appealing to the one that hates him by sending him the gift? No, you don't think so? Bridget, you do think so? It looks weak. It's like, do we want to do that? Let's apply that to our day and age. Imagine if we went to Iran today, to what's his name over there, Khomeini, right, or Ahmadinejad, or one of those guys, and we come to them with $100 million, and we say, you know what? Maybe we could reconsider the deal. Oh, right. I'm not getting political. That's right, Marty. So let's say Israel did that. Let's say Israel came in and said, we'll give you $100 million and maybe we can renegotiate. That might look, it probably will look weak. So what exactly is going on in here? What kind of biblical precedent are we supposed to draw from this episode in the Torah? Nancy's giving me the eyes here, right? You're not happy, right? This is good. Let's discuss it. Herein we experience a transformation of our perception of anti-Semitism. You see, Jacob understood that everything is always in the hands of God. Everything is always in the hands of Hashem. There is no other power other than God Almighty, the master of the universe. By the way, God didn't just create the world, he continues to create the world at every single moment in time. But that's more advanced. So it was with this realization that Jacob realized that God is always in control. However, you may remember what we learned in lesson 1 is that God likes to remain anonymous. He wants to be hidden because if God is revealed, we won't have any freedom of choice anymore. You won't be able to say, well, maybe I won't do a mitzvah, maybe I won't keep Shabbos. You won't be able to have freedom of choice if God is obvious and apparent. That's why God likes to disguise himself. It's called the doctrine of divine anonymity. What we need to do, and Jacob understood this, was to create a space for God's protection. He needed to create a disguise for God's blessing to take effect. Once we put a disguise in place, then God can bless our actions, and it doesn't look like it came directly from God. You can easily say that it came from somewhere else. Like, let's talk about the 6-Day War for just a brief second. If you think about it, the 6-Day War, we were grossly outnumbered. Mind the pun. We were vastly outnumbered in the 6-Day War. How did we win that war? So many Jews will say that was a miracle from God. But many Jews will say that it was the resilience and the courage of the soldiers of the IDF. Right? In other words, we're not clear, we're not sure. It's not an open miracle, it's like a hidden miracle. When God knows that his efforts and his actions are hidden, that's when we've created a space for God's protection. And that is the perspective with which Jacob approaches his anti-Semites by sending him this massive gift of livestock. By sending him the gift, he knew that God is the cause of the problem and God is the solution to the problem. Only God who has the power over him. No anti-Semite has the power over him. Jacob's approach understood that there is no room to fear Esau. I'm not afraid of him. I know that God holds the key to my salvation. I just need to find a way to hide it. And if I can find a way to hide God's blessing, that will be the trigger for God's protection. In other words, when a Jew in the biblical precedent responds to anti-Semitism with diplomacy, it's not weakness. If you're afraid of the anti-Semite, then it is weakness. But if you're not afraid of the anti-Semite because you know it's a test from God, and you know that God just wants an alibi, a smokescreen, there is no weakness. It's a game. God is playing a game with you, and you are responding by giving God what he wants, and then God gives you the desired result. Let's see what actually happened at the end of the story. So how did this all turn out? Let's take a look at page 119. Text number 3 tells us the Torah. Esau ran towards Jacob and he embraced him. He fell on Jacob's neck and he kissed him, and they wept. So all of this ended very, very nicely. When Esau came, instead of 400 men trying to kill Jacob, he ended up giving him a really beautiful kiss. And that was the end of it. Was that a sincere kiss? Did he really love Jacob? The Torah tells us, if you look at the screen here, you'll see the word encircled in red. Vayishakehu, and he kissed him, it's got dots on top of the word inside of the Torah. It's very unusual. You know, there's no vowels in the Torah, there's only letters. So when you have a word in the Torah that has dots, it's very unusual. So why are there dots on top of that word? Our sages tell us that when there's a word with dots in the Torah, it's coming to tell you something more than meets the eye. You'll see in text number 4 that there's actually a conflict about whether it was a sincere kiss, temporary love, or was it fake love. Either way, it doesn't really matter because Jacob survived the ordeal. He got exactly what he needed. When Jacob put in place the mechanism that God needed, that God wants in order to be able to bring the salvation, he made the diplomacy. He feared not the anti-Semite, but he understood that God is always in control. Then God was able to bring him the blessing without it looking like an open miracle. It looked like Esau just had a change of heart, and we're all good for now. But what lesson could we possibly learn from this particular precedent? Is this something practical? Is it something that we can apply in our personal lives as we encounter anti-Semites on the public stage? Is there a message that we can implement over here? We know as Jews that whatever is listed in the Torah is not there just for historical purposes, but everything that happens to our patriarchs and matriarchs is a mirror of what will happen to the children. Just like a parent bequeaths genes and characteristics to the child, so too when the Torah tells us a story about our patriarchs and matriarchs, it's because the same thing is ultimately destined to happen to the children as well. And we too can and should wield influence over the Esau's of our future generations as well. I'd like to share with you some examples of Jews that used this biblical passage as a precedent, the first of which was Rabbi Yanai in the days of the Romans. He had to relate to the very anti-Semitic Roman rulers of the land of Israel. And let's take a look at how he would use and apply this biblical precedent in protecting his people. If you turn to page 121, text number 5, the Medrash relates that when Rabbi Yanai would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read this passage in the Torah regarding Jacob and Esau. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Yanai would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the wise Jacob. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach and adopt it in actual practice. This approach is one where we try to engage the anti-Semitic rulers or politicians, try to engage with them diplomatically to figure out a way to make it work using war only as a very last resort. It's a faith-filled approach. It's higher consciousness. It's about getting what you can and doing what it takes to get it. It's much less about worrying, about looking weak in the eyes of the anti-Semites, and it's more about appearing strong in the eyes of God. Another example was the famous Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has a whole Jewish holiday after him. If you've heard of Lag BaOmer, anybody heard of that Jewish holiday when we light bonfires in the summertime? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is buried up in the north of Israel near Tzfat in the town of Miron, where that awful tragedy happened last year, where there was a collapsing of the bleachers. Many people died. It was quite tragic. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was actually one of the most important characters in the history of the promotion of the Kabbalah, of the teaching of the Zohar. He was one that wrote down the book of the Kabbalah, the book of the Zohar, while he was hiding for 13 years from the Romans who were trying to kill him. Rabbi Shimon understood that the Romans were no friends of the Jews. In fact, this quote is from him. It is an established fact that Esau hates Jacob, and he said that in the present tense. What he meant was that Rome hates Israel. So Rabbi Shimon was not naive by any stretch of the imagination. He understood that the Romans were trying to kill the Jews. These were very, very difficult times for the Jewish people when they outlawed by pain of death the bris and the Shabbos and the Jewish calendar and the study of Torah. The Romans were quite brutal to the Jews. Yet, when needed, Rabbi Shimon would travel to Rome in order to win concessions. There was a story, actually. We'll take a look before the story, page 122. The Roman government once issued a decree that Jews may not observe Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. The Jews said to themselves, who should go to Rome to solicit annulment of the decree? Let Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai go, for he is experienced in miracles. This is from the Talmud. The Talmud tells us Rabbi Shimon went off to Rome when, by chance, by destiny, the daughter of Caesar became possessed. Nobody was able to cure her except for Rabbi Shimon. He was the one that was able to cure her from her being possessed by a demon. When the Roman emperor offered him anything as a reward, he asked for the paper, for the documents of the decree against the Jews. He ripped it up and he left. Like they said, for Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is experienced in miracles. Here's a man who understood realistically the hate of the anti-Semites. He personally experienced it as he had to hide for 13 years in a cave. His teacher, Rabbi Akiva, was brutally executed by the Romans. Yet, he understood to compartmentalize. That on the one hand they hate, but I can still cut a deal with them just like Jacob. I don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I know that God is always in control. And if I can just remember that I'm not afraid of the anti-Semites, I need to find God's favor. How do I find God's favor? By diplomatically engaging with the enemy and finding a way to hide God's blessing behind diplomacy. This was the attitude of many, many Jewish leaders throughout the 1500s. You can see a list in figure 4.1 of many Jewish leaders throughout all of Europe, page 123, all over Europe in the 1500s through to the 1800s. Jewish shtadlanim, they called them. Shtadlanim are court Jews. These are Jews that would appeal to the leadership, to the politicians in their courts and try to find favor with the anti-Semites on behalf of their fellow Jews. They were famous Jewish advocates. One of the most famous amongst them was Rabbi Yosef of Rosheim. He lived from 1480 to 1554, and he made it his business to advocate on behalf of German Jews in the court of Maximilian I and his grandson, Charles V. Now, Charles V was particularly anti-Semitic. It was in his blood. He was the grandson, through his mother, of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of the Spanish expulsion edict. So this guy was actually in charge of the Iberian Peninsula. He was king of the Iberian Peninsula during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. So this is clearly no friend of the Jews. Yet, as we gain insight into the life of Rabbi Yosef of Rosheim, we find that he doesn't go to war against this anti-Semitic king. Rather, he engages in diplomacy. Take a look at text number 7. In 1531, this is the words of Rabbi Yosef himself. In 1531, the denouncers once again hounded the emperor while he was in Belgium and Holland, lands uninhabited by Jews. Many requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers with the help of God. I was at the court of the exalted emperor for 4 months, from the 1st of Adar until the 1st of Sivan, pursuing the interests of the Jewish communities. Although Rothroyd, we don't know who this guy was, but we know that he was a terrible anti-Semite. Although Rothroyd attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, God in his great mercy sent his messenger and saved me from his hands and from all those who sought to harm me. At that time, I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded sympathetically. During this period, when I had free time and secluded in my room, I authored a book entitled The Sanctified Path. There's no doubt that this Rabbi Yosef of Rosheim understood clearly who he was dealing with, yet his goal was clear: to cut a deal even with the enemy. Because to be a Jew, the Torah approach, the Jacob approach, to anti-Semitism is that we're never afraid of the anti-Semite himself. We always know that it's God who is always in control. And it's only God's grace that we need to make sure that we are carrying. We're never afraid of the anti-Semite himself. Admittedly, this model did not always work. You'll see on the screen over here, picture. During the Spanish expulsion, on the screen here you see it, we'll get the lights in a second. Thank you. So on the screen, you'll see a picture. This is actually a painting from the Prado Museum in Madrid. I have to tell you, when my wife and I visited Madrid, I had a very hard time relaxing over there. We were en route to South Africa, and we had about a day to enjoy Madrid, but I just couldn't. I knew that every inch of Madrid is soaked with Jewish blood. Every public square was the site of an auto da fe, an act of faith, of public burning of living Jews, men, women, and children because of their faith. It's horrible. It was there where Don Isaac Abarbanel, who was the CFO of the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, he was trying to curry the favor of the king and queen. In this picture, you see them in the background. By the way, this picture's sanitized. They took out the religious symbols that were in the background of the picture, if it doesn't look exactly like it does in the Prado Museum. So what happened was, you see Don Isaac Abarbanel appealing to the king, asking him to have mercy upon the Jews, when right in the middle of the picture, there's that fella, Thomas de Torquemada. He's the fanatical monk who entered. He was the one that stirred up the king and the queen against the Jews. He storms into the audience of Don Isaac Abarbanel. This is according to the legend. And whilst Abarbanel was trying so desperately to curry the favor of the king and the queen, he storms in this guy, Thomas de Torquemada, and he cries out, "Judas sold him for 30 pieces of silver, and now you want to sell him again." Apparently, that did it. And the king and queen refused to allow Abarbanel to convince them. It wasn't only the Spanish expulsion and Inquisition where diplomatic efforts failed. It was Hitler and Haman and many others as well. You see, when dealing with true evil, we need to resort to the third tactic of Jacob, which is war. When dealing with pure evil, with those that are trying to actively kill us, diplomacy is not going to work. We're talking today about the Parav anti-Semites. They're not milchik, they're not fleshik, they're like in the middle, you know? They're American politicians, they're American celebrities. They don't talk about themselves as anti-Semites. They don't even think of themselves as anti-Semites, but we feel that they're anti-Semites. This class today is about those guys in between, the ones that don't admit that they're anti-Semites. So even though this approach of diplomacy did not work at all times in Jewish history, many times, however, it worked. And we know that it's not weakness because we know that we're in the hands of God. Like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they said about him that he was experienced in miracles. Like Rabbi Yosef of Roshheim, who in his quote that we read earlier, he said, with the help of God, he said earlier, I knew that they were favorable towards me. These Jewish leaders throughout all the ages, using the biblical precedent of Jacob, understood that they simply needed to create a disguise to hide the blessing of God, that it shouldn't be so obvious, it shouldn't be so apparent. Pleading with an authority might make you feel inferior if it's the anti-Semite that you're afraid of. But the Jewish approach is higher consciousness. We know that even the anti-Semites is only a tool in the hands of God. It's a test to test our reaction. How will we respond, with fear or with faith? When we recognize that you are in God's hands, we don't feel inferior. It's actually quite empowering. It's more embarrassing to think that some Gentile hater has power over us. And it's more empowering to know that nobody has any power over us. We have nothing to fear and no one to be afraid of. There's only one power that we need to appeal to, and that is the master of the universe. Can you reach that level of absolute fearlessness from your anti-Semite? Think about that for a moment. Can you imagine if that anti-Semite that you thought about earlier, whether it's a politician, a celebrity, or a neighbor, could you imagine how empowering it would feel that I have nothing to be afraid of from that person? They cannot harm me. I need to make sure that I understand that it is all a test from God, and the anti-Semite is the tool which God has engaged in order to test my reaction, but they clearly have no power over me. Now, in case this sounds absolutely ridiculous, in case it sounds completely irrational, science actually supports this particular view. In July 28, 2006, Mel Gibson was pulled over with a DUI by a Jewish police officer. It had to be a Jew. In his drunken stupor, he asked the police officer from the back of the squad car if he was Jewish, to which the officer, James Mee, responded yes. And it was at that point that Mel Gibson said that the Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world. And he went on and on about his hatred for the Jews. Even though he later apologized, it became a sensational story as everybody said, oh, there we go. He's exposed his true colors. We're all boycotting Mel Gibson. He's exposed himself as an absolute bigot, xenophobe, racist, anti-Semite. We hate him. We're never going to go to his movies ever again. His friend, his Jewish friend, Dean Devlin, came to his aid. And he blamed him on the alcohol. He said, it wasn't really Gibson. I'm a Jew. I'm his friend. He doesn't really hate the Jews. Do you believe him? You think he's a hater, huh? You don't watch his movies anymore?
I don't.
Okay. Well, neuroscience discusses the case of Gibson's true mental position. Let's take a look at what science has to say about this. It's text 8A, page 128. David Eagleman, PhD in neuroscience from Baylor College of Medicine. He says like this: brains are like representative democracies. They are built of multiple overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. There is an ongoing conversation amongst the different factions in your brain, each competing to control the single output channel of your behavior. It's a war going on inside of you about what is going to be the final decision. When the hostess at a party offers chocolate cake, now I got your attention, right? When she offers chocolate cake, you find yourself on the horns of a dilemma. Some parts of your brain have evolved to crave the rich energy source of sugar. Other parts care about the negative consequences, such as the health of your heart. Part of you wants the cake, and part of you tries to muster the fortitude to forgo it. The final vote of the parliament determines which party controls your action. That is, whether you put your hand up or out. As the French essayist Michel de Montaigne puts it, he says, it's probably Michel de Montaigne, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right, thank you. Michel de Montaigne puts it, there is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. Brilliant. There is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. Our brains are made up of multiple competing viewpoints. Just because we made a decision to go right, It doesn't mean that 49% of our brain is not saying to go left. Our brains are not binary. It's not black or white, good or bad, lover or hater. Applying this wisdom to Gibson, he continues. Text 8b, a team of rivals. Returning to Mel Gibson and his drunken tirade, we can ask whether there is such a thing as true colors. We have seen that behavior is the outcome of the battle amongst internal systems. To be clear, I am not defending Gibson's despicable behavior, but I am saying that a team of rivals' brain can naturally harbor both racist and non-racist feelings. Alcohol is not a truth serum. Instead, it tends to tip the battle toward the short term. Did you read Malcolm Gladwell Speaking to Strangers? He talks about alcohol focusing you on the short term. It's not about the truth serum as much as it is what's here and right now. Unreflective faction, which is no more or less claim than any other faction to be the true position, to be the true one. Turns out, friends, we are complicated beings. We are not one-dimensional. Hence, it makes perfect sense to appeal to someone who seems anti-Semitic because they can flip on a dime. Remember Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he says, Esau, it's a law, he said, Esau hates Jacob in the present tense. The Romans hate the Jews, but he still made it his business to travel to Rome to appeal to them because he figured that they can still flip the switch. Remember when we had those dots on top of the word and he kissed them in the Torah? When there was all that confusion, did Esau really love Jacob, or was he only feigning love? All that confusion about the true feelings of Esau, maybe that's exactly the right answer. Maybe the right answer is confusion. Maybe the right answer is dots, because when it comes to the hate of a hater, they themselves don't know if they really hate, or they fake hate, or they partially hate, or they sometimes hate, because we are a team of rival brains. As this neuroscientist said, our brains are like representative parliaments. So let's try to apply this wisdom to modern day precedent. Let's see how this pans out in their right here and right now. Let's zoom fast forward from 3,700 years ago, from Jacob and Esau, from the Roman era and the Middle Ages, all the way through to 1990. Let's see how this panned out in recent modern cases that seem also to prove this point. You see, today, we have options. Unlike our ancestors during the Roman era who dared not stand up to the Romans, or our ancestors during the Middle Ages who lived under the fiefdoms of the European lords, today, with unprecedented freedoms in this extraordinary United States of America, today with the power of social media, literally the power that you can hold in the palm of your hand to influence minds and hearts across the world, with boycotts and sanctions, today we can actually fight back. Today, we have options that our ancestors might not have been able to access. Should we today respond more aggressively to the anti-Semites? Or should we stick to the approach of Jacob, which was keeping war only as a last resort, but working primarily on his prayer and diplomacy? Let's go back to that French president, Pompidou, Georges Pompidou. What actually happened is exactly like you suggested, Nancy. There were fierce demonstrations. He came to Chicago, and the Jews across the board expressed their frustration and anger, to the point that President Nixon had to calm it down. Let's take a look, text number 9, page 131. President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults to himself and his wife during pro-Israel demonstrations, touched off by his visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by a jostling that members of his party received from demonstrators in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries and by what he viewed as acceptance of such hostile acts by the Chicago police. So Nixon had to calm him down. He was pretty upset. As it happens, was that the right response? It was at that time that the Rebbe made some beautiful comments that shed light on what is the correct Jewish approach in light of everything that we've already discussed. In text 10a, the Rebbe points out that while they had good intentions, it sadly backfired. Take a look. Text 10a, page 132. The public protests against the president of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent or at least reduce French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and that American Jews are not cowardly. This is a worthwhile objective, said the Rebbe, when Jewish lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or at least to prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past. And that's what the Rebbe was saying, is that by attacking him publicly, they were putting him literally in a corner, forcing him to put up his guards and saying, I'm not going to bow to your requests because you're not asking nicely, right? Honey draws more bees than vinegar, right? The Rebbe continued about what happened. Text 10b. When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. This effort backfired. It can now be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel, items that can be sold without attracting publicity. That's what he had approved. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval for such sales was withdrawn. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with Jews behind closed doors, and he reinstituted the small arms sales. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Jewish media was warned against disclosing any of this, and we only know of this from the non-Jewish press. The conclusion we must draw from this case, says the Rebbe, is that we do not influence anti-Semites by constantly yelling at them, you are an anti-Semite, you are a thief, you are a murderer. Rather, engage them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think about them, they are nevertheless human beings, and they wish to behave like human beings. In the case of President Pompidou, when we stopped attacking him, he made a total turnaround. Respect is more effective than attacks. Yes, Joel?
I just want to point out, this is AIPAC's philosophy of dealing with the U.S. government and dealing with anti-Semitism. We are not a protest organization. We don't stand in front of the White House carrying signs. We lobby quietly in the offices of senators and congressmen to convince them to see the right path.
I just want to say that, repeat what Joel just said for the video and for anybody else that might not have heard. What Joel was saying is that this is exactly the mission of AIPAC, which is not to fight against the anti-Semites, but to find a way to convince them. Which means AIPAC will engage with politicians that are deemed to be, by many Jews, anti-Semitic. They will go after them and they'll talk to them and they'll engage with them and they'll even give them support, right? Because they feel that very consistent with what we're saying right now is that it's not black or white. You're not binary. You're not a hater or a lover. You're not an anti-Semite or a philo-Semite with nothing in between. This is a team of rivals, brain. There's one difference though with this approach. The AIPAC approach is purely political. I'm not sure, again, I'm not here to criticize, God forbid, but as you bring it up, the element that we're bringing to the table right now, and what I would love to see AIPAC introduce, and I think they do actually, now that I think about it, at the conventions, there's always kosher food, only kosher food, and there's always minions and Shabbat observance going on over there. Faith is a very important part of this conversation. The realization that it's not the anti-Semite that we're afraid of. It's only God that has power over us. And that's a mindset which is really nice to see when an organization like AIPAC is able to bring Jewish values, Torah observances to the table. So that's really great. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disagree. I'm actually agreeing with what you just said. Okay. So another practical modern day example, thank you for that, Joel, is Jesse Helms, Senator Jesse Helms. Elected in 1972 to the US Senate from North Carolina, he voted against Israel consistently for a decade. He was a pariah, hated by Jews across the board. He was the one who was totally against any foreign aid to Israel. And in the 1982 Lebanon War, he suggested that the United States break off all ties with Israel whatsoever. This guy was bad news. 1984, Chabad in Washington, D.C. held an event to celebrate the Rebbe's 82nd birthday. It was the Rebbe's birthday being designated by President Ronald Reagan and both houses as Education Day USA. Till this day, the Rebbe's birthday, right before Pesach, it's 4 days before Pesach, is every year recognized since then as Education Day USA, recognized by bipartisan support from both parts of the house, both houses. And the purpose of Education Day USA is to upgrade the ethical and moral foundations of education in all American schools. At this very high-end event with all the top brass of Washington, D.C., together with the Washington elite, who shows up? Senator Jesse Helms. Now, Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz was livid. He was furious, so much so that he actually wrote a letter to the Rebbe complaining, how dare Chabad honor this anti-Semite? Now, the Rebbe's response was, Chabad didn't honor him, he honored Chabad. Don't confuse his presence in the audience with his presence on the dais, right? He attended the event, he honored Education Day USA, and it's not that he was being honored at all. Let's take a look at what the Rebbe had to say to Dershowitz here in this very beautiful letter. Page 136, text number 11. I trust that you will agree that in regards to persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there is a likelihood that it may be the forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. My experience with such people, said the Rebbe, though I've never personally met this said person, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. Powerful. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all of them, are subject to change in their positions depending on time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war. nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite, quote unquote, however tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it. It can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. There is surely no need to point out to you that responsible Jewish leaders consistently cultivated good public relations, indeed even cordial relations, with President Carter and his predecessors going back to President Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings towards Jews and Jewish causes. Ultimately, Alan Dershowitz wrote a postscript of his own. You see, Helms was soon appointed to the very powerful position, soon after this story, soon appointed to the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he suddenly became one of the strongest supporters of Israel and Jewish causes as well. I'd like you to hear this story from Alan Dershowitz himself and his speech to the International Convention of Chabad Rabbis in 2006.
Wow, what a gathering. The energy, the love, the Yiddishkeit in this room are beyond belief. Whenever I hear people talk about the diminution of Judaism around the world, I wish they could be here tonight to experience this. 35 years ago, I had this chus to meet with the great Rebbe. It was for me one of the great honors and educational experiences of my life. We then corresponded, and I continued to learn from the Rebbe so much. I remember I had the chutzpah once to write him a letter saying, Rebbe, how come for your 80th birthday, you decided among those you wanted to honor was Senator Jesse Helms? At the time, Senator Jesse Helms could, I think, be fairly described as a Sonei Israel. He was not a friend of the Jewish people. He was not a friend of Israel. So, in my naivete, I wrote the Rebbe a letter. He wrote me back one of the most beautiful responses. He said, you honor not only to influence the past, but to influence the future. He said, watch Senator Jesse Helms over the next years and see whether or not our decision was the correct one. Within a year of that honor, Jesse Helms had become one of the strongest supporters of Israel in the United States Senate. And as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, one of its most important. You live and you learn. And I learned a great deal. I learned a great deal
We don't know exactly what caused him to turn, but the fact is that Senator Jesse Helms turned. The lesson is clear, that we can't give up on them just because they behave badly. Our minds are complicated places. When we name and shame them, we're literally pushing them into a corner and we're forcing them to fight back. But if we're able to take the wisdom of Jacob and the biblical precedents, preparing spiritually with prayer, as well as diplomacy, hiding, creating a disguise for God's beautiful, bountiful blessing. We know that through engaging in that diplomacy, in that conversation, in that appeal, in that gift, working with those perceived anti-Semites, just like AIPAC is doing, then what's happening is that we're winning friends or turning enemies into friends because this is not binary. This is not black or white. Yes, we need war, but only as a very last resort. Pompidou and Jesse Helms, in the modern case studies that we just presented, both of them turned around when we stopped throwing them under the bus. On a practical level, we can apply this wisdom by saying you should speak softly, but carry a big stick. When needed, you gotta be ready for the fight. But we can't rush to point fingers at anti-Semites. We should be quicker to engage and influence, slower to name and shame. This is relevant not only to leaders, but also on a personal, individual level. We all know that classmate, that coworker, or that neighbor which seems to be an anti-Semite. Don't brand them as such. Don't name and shame them. Try diplomacy first. Give it all you got. Don't be afraid of them. Remember, they have no power over you. By engaging in diplomacy, you're creating the alibi, the disguise for God's blessing to take effect. And if all else fails, okay, go for war. That is the three-pronged approach of Jacob. But there's a very painful flip side to this as well. The flip side is, remember the complicated brain that we have, right? So with that flip side, even not only can our enemies turn into friends, but our friends too can turn against us. Remember what it says on the US currency: in God we trust, everybody else pays cash, right? We cannot trust in any human being, in any president or prime minister, in any politician or governor, senator, or anybody else for that matter. We have to always remember that we're not afraid of people and we don't trust in people. That would be akin to idolatry. We only trust in God Almighty. I trust us to only be God. And that is this deeply empowering approach where we're not running around afraid of our own shadows, afraid of some next politician that's going to rise up against us, the next head of the HOA that's going to ban the mezuzah or the sukkah or God knows what else they're going to ban. We're not afraid of them because we know that Hashem is always, always in control. And even when we find a friend, we always remember friends are complicated. And we got to remember where our loyalties need to lie. Our goal should be in creating an environment where goodness and kindness is promoted everywhere, where we're able to bring out the best in society, where we Jews can become an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations, where we can bring goodness and kindness, positive energy all around us. Just like Education Day USA, where we can bring positive morals, values, and ethics to every element of society, because when we do that, we're setting the stage to be able to bring out the best in people. We're setting the diplomatic effort, preempting any anti-Semitism ever, even before it raises its ugly head. I know that APAC does that with their college program, where they watch people already in college, right? Where they watch the rising stars and they track them even before they ever hit the public stage. They want to train them young, and we want to make sure that just like APAC is doing for politicians, we want to do that to society in general, not only for politicians, but for neighbors and employers, bosses, and all sorts of business titans and regular Joes next door. We want to make sure that we can influence the world by making the world a more kinder and better place. Let's take a look at this brief presentation.
Negative thoughts, actions, and speech create negative energy. Conversely, positive thoughts, actions, and speech create positive energy. And that's what led with an idea that has its genesis in South Africa, to the idea of ARK, acts of random kindness. You see, this is kind of shaped a little bit, more or less, if you use your imagination, like Noah's Ark. And the idea is you take some change, you place it in here, and when it's filled up, we pass it along to someone who's less fortunate. It isn't just the money collected, it's the thought and the feeling that it represents.
I went to a public school. I studied math and physics, and we studied how to solve math problems. I didn't know how to solve my own problems.
Rabbi David Aaron, a Jerusalem-based educator, reflects on his personal experience.
The real problems of life is what education should be focusing on. It's essentially about building people, and only great people will do great things.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Mr. President.
On March 3rd, 1981, then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered a luncheon address at the Washington Hilton. He left the hotel at 2:27 p.m., but as he headed to his limousine, a would-be assassin opened fire. Reagan was critically wounded, and the nation collectively gasped in horror. The president survived, and at a public gathering 2 weeks later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe insisted that the instructive lesson of the assassination attempt must similarly survive. The Rebbe saw the event as a wake-up call for the nation to upgrade its approach to education.
In der Beistefer mit Yusuf und durchgenommen. Abos darf gern a Beistefer darf gern Idee. Nicht darf exportieren, Buftor, Bufmachen. Dem Jeser Leben oder, als soll sein mit Stevens. Und soll wissen, als stark, als geht und lernt den Beistefer. Aber der Rike lernen seine ist. Was zum Tom Thema Rumsi und das der Thema mit Parsit, die das in ganzen Niederei in der Tochnis und in der Programm von BC.
As much as we want to graduate mathematicians and scientists, we also want to graduate decent human beings.
Dr. Rona Novak, Dean of the Israeli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, has given ample thought to this problem.
Very few educators would invite a charismatic speaker or have a big assembly program to create readers. They would understand that the way that we build reading skills is piece by piece and building block by building block. We start in kindergarten and first grade, and we keep building on it. Well, we need to look at character education and social emotional learning in exactly the same way.
Judaism teaches us that it's important to give charity every day. And the more you give charity, that muscle of kindness within you gets stronger and stronger.
Rabbi Levi Greenberg and his wife Shana are emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in El Paso, Texas.
We embarked on a campaign to bring this message of daily giving to every single child in El Paso. And so we brought to El Paso the Ark Campaign. All the children in the school received one of these boxes, and they were told that the purpose of this box is to be taken home and filled every day. If they have extra coins, they should ask their parents for some money. After a month of collecting money, their class would nominate charities that should receive their combined money. And the winning charity would receive the combined monies that they had collected throughout that month. The Ark Project, giving money every day, takes acts of random kindness and turns them into acts of routine kindness.
Raising a generation of individuals empowered with a sense of purpose and trained to pursue acts of kindness is an important factor in curing and preventing numerous social ills, including the reduction of hate and bigotry, along with anti-Semitism.
The more we give, the more we respect. We respect human life, we respect property, the more dignity we have for ourselves and for society. If we want to stop anti-Semitism, we have to stop hatred. We have the opportunity to nip hatred in the bud by increasing in acts of goodness and kindness and inspiring and encouraging all of humanity to do so. Every single person should give charity every day, and hatred will be a thing of the past.
The call of the hour, more necessary than ever, is for each of us to adopt a charity box for regular daily contributions and to encourage all around us, family and friend, Jew and non-Jew, to act similarly. Actively demonstrate, encourage, and promote kindness, sympathy, and altruistic care. If a little illumination eliminates a lot of darkness, think of what a rapidly swelling force of systematic goodness can achieve for our communities and ultimately for humanity. It's time to turn up the light.
This is a revolutionary approach, friends. A revolutionary approach to anti-Semitism. What we've learned over the past 4 sessions is that there's more than meets the eye to anti-Semitism. It's about us opening our eyes and realizing, seeing the bigger picture, realizing that yes, it is a test of faith, a test of faith. And that it's up to us to decide what choice we make in our response. Are we merely fighting back by literally shooting the messenger? Or are we addressing the core root of the problem, which is the understanding that God is trying to get our attention? What are we going to do about it? Let's summarize some of the things that we spoke about here. It's on page 139, figure 4.3. What we've discussed in the past 4 sessions. Again, page 139, figure 4.3. Number 1, we will remain calm. We will trust in God and upgrade our connection to Him. We will create natural means through which God can provide our security. We will not internalize anti-Semitism by altering our Jewish heritage. We will be open about our Jewish identity, benefiting Jews and fostering diversity. We will share awareness of God's mission for all humanity and thereby help individuals avoid experiencing an inner void. We will thank God for the divine gift of the Holy Land and seek to strengthen its security and prosperity. And finally, what we learned today, we will avoid labels and public shaming. Instead, we will work with whomever we can to ensure beneficial results for the Jewish people. This is the evolution of our thinking on anti-Semitism, which we've discussed and learned about in the past 4 sessions, in the past 4 weeks. But in addition, one final closing point. In addition to knowing how to respond to anti-Semitism when it comes to responding to Gentiles, even more important is how we respond to each other. More important than how we treat anti-Semites is how we treat Semites. You see, in the Purim story, Haman attacked the Jews for their lack of unity that left us vulnerable. It was our disunity that served as the secret, the spiritual vulnerability with which Haman was able to attack us. And what was Esther's antidote in that story? She gathered the Jewish people. She brought us together as one. And for all time, what do we do ever since then on Purim? We send gifts of food to each other, shalach manas, garnering love, friendship baskets that we literally send to each other. On a deep level, God protects us when we are united. And when we are disunited, we are vulnerable to attack. In closing, our best response to anti-Semitism is going straight to the root, recognizing that it's God Almighty that harbors that holds the power. His greatest blessing to us is when we're united, and its most deeply insulting to him is when we are not united. Think about how you feel when your kids get along with each other, and think about how you feel when your kids don't get along with each other. That is how God feels when we work it out with our fellow Jews, and God forbid, when we don't. The paradigm shifts that we've learned today. Number one, two paradigm shifts. Number one, we cannot put people into boxes, neat boxes of good and bad, because human beings are complicated. They can flip on a dime. We've got to learn how to deal with them, learn from Jacob. And the second paradigm shift is that diplomacy is not a weakness. It's actually a powerful spiritual expression of our unwavering faith in the power of God Almighty. Diplomacy is just a method through which we disguise his blessing and allow him to unleash it upon us. I'd like to conclude with this summary video and then one more special brief video presentation.
Lesson 4, change of heart. 1. The Torah's narrative of Jacob and Esau suggests that by employing the right words and deeds, we can influence those we deem to be against us. Accordingly, the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai traveled to Rome to win concessions for the benefit of the Jewish community, establishing a model followed by countless others, most famously the European court Jews of the early modern period. 2. Jews did not feel inferior while conducting diplomatic missions. They knew that the Jewish future depended on God, and that their job was to generate a garment behind which God could conceal his blessings. A firm belief that they were in God's hands inspired in them a sense of pride. 3. According to modern neuroscience, brains are built of multiple parts that weigh in concerning different choices, each part competing to control the single output channel of behavior. This explains why an individual with Jewish friends can nevertheless carry out a drunken tirade against Jews. Conversely, it explains why Jews can gain assistance from unlikely sources. 4. Today, we are finally able to campaign publicly against those who oppose us. However, it is often counterproductive to publicly brand individuals as enemies or anti-Semites. Slow to shame and quick to engage is still an effective route. 5. We must do everything possible to condition society to bring out the best in people rather than their more sinister elements. In the sphere of education, this means promoting an approach that is not restricted to acquiring information, but rather includes proper character traits, self-discipline, and the awareness that all humans are created to actively generate goodness in their environments. 6. Living in harmony with our fellow Jews enables us to better collaborate to ward off threats and promote our interests. Jewish mysticism teaches that God responds positively to Jewish unity, providing overt blessings of protection and goodness.
So just before we wrap it up, I just want to give you a sneak preview, a 2-minute trailer of what's coming next. So that, friends, is the upcoming JLI course. It's been such a pleasure studying with you over the past 4 weeks. I'm so grateful to each and every one of you for being here with us and for studying this course together with me. Particularly, I'm grateful to you, Lauren Gross, and the whole Gross family of the Gross Family Center for the Study of Antisemitism and the Holocaust, for putting this subject at the front and center of Jewish consciousness and awareness. Such an important topic. Thank you for partnering with us. We look forward to many great things ahead in the future.